African and African American Studies. This is my second opportunity to moderate these political debates. So for those of you who have not attended one of these lively encounters, let me go over the ground rules. But first, here are the topics of the night. First, you will hear folks talk about the fiscal cliff. Second, gun control. Third, the war in Afghanistan. And then the fourth, I just can't wait, the ban on sodas over 16 ounces in the, I guess, the school system or in the city of New York. We'll find out more about that. All right, so there'll be two presenters, two debaters. They'll have a 90-second opening statement from each, then a 6-minute lively back and forth between the two participants, and then a 1-minute closing, and we'll open the floor for a few questions from the audience. But because there are 4 topics, we'll be able to handle maybe 2 or 3 questions per item. Except for topic 4, which now they're telling me there's 2 minutes, 6, 1, and 3. Okay, so we give them 30 seconds more to talk about sodas. I don't have the names of the folks presenting the pros and the cons on these topics, so I'll just ask for 2 individuals who are discussing the fiscal cliff if they would come forward, and then they'll have to introduce themselves. Was there a coin toss?
We're just going first.
Okay, so I'm Bridget Brennan. Okay, so I'll begin. So what was in the fiscal cliff deal? I'm just going to break it down real quick for you. So what would have happened if we had fallen off the fiscal cliff, so to say, would have been a tax rate increase on pretty much all forms of income, and it would have resulted in automatic spending cuts nearly across the board to all spending programs. It would have been extremely damaging to our economy, especially during the time of heightened unemployment. So what do we need to do because of this fiscal cliff? We need a balanced budget of moderate spending cuts and revenue increases to deal with our debt problem. And in addition to also replacing the remaining sequester cuts that are looming in the following months in March. So this whole debate over the fiscal cliff has always been much more than just about the Bush tax cuts. It has been a combination of the 3 biggest spending and unbudgeted for endeavors in America's history, which include the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Medicare Part D, and yes, the giant unnecessary tax cuts that were given primarily to the wealthiest of our nation during the Bush administration. So what we need to do is we ran up spending and we slashed taxes for too long, and so the only reasonable prescription to our debt ceiling problem is a combination of tax increases while closing loopholes and certain tax breaks, in addition to some spending cuts. However, spending cuts cannot fix this problem alone. Most reforms to entitlement programs take time. Sorry?
Thank you.
Okay.
I will cut off the speakers after I'll give you a few more seconds. You got 9 minutes.
Cool. All right. I'm Victor Boccia. I'm from Texas. Texas is the best. Number 1 driver of our future deficits will not be tax increases or tax cuts. It won't be a slow economy, a war with an enemy, or a high degree of income inequality. Well, then what will the major source of our deficits be? If you guessed Medicare, you're correct. Any plan to bring our country to sustainable spending that does not attack the problem of Medicare in a rational way is not a plan at all. In light of this fact, the fiscal cliff deal was a failure. Remember, the reason Washington folks set up the fiscal cliff deadline the way they did was to force the issue. The threat was clear. Sequestration would kick in immediately as the ball dropped on January 1. Everyone would see their taxes go up and huge spending cuts would go into effect. Our elected officials had 507 days between the Budget Control Act and the fiscal cliff deadline to make serious reforms and avoid the threat. However, there was one problem. Democrats would be in control the whole time. Democrats prevented anything substantive from happening. Yes, we did avoid the cliff. However, our fiscal situation is no better today than it was yesterday. All that being said, I appreciate my leaders in the Republican Party who agreed to raise taxes on high-income earners in order to prevent what would have been the largest tax hike in the history of our nation. I also appreciate the fact that the very next weekend, Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan made it clear that the tax debate is over. President Obama and the Senate now know for sure that we are through with taxes. Now that the debt ceiling deadline has been extended a few months, I look forward to seeing the Democratic Party's ideas on how to reform entitlements.
All right, now we move into a 6-minute back and forth between our presenters.
Sure. So what you addressed about entitlements. Yes, entitlements in our country do take up a majority of the revenue that we do spend. However, they are crucial and necessary to our economy. There's no way we can do without these entitlements completely, and simply cutting these programs will lead to future problems in our nation. That's not the result that we want. What we need to do is make short-term cuts to these programs that are minimal, something that will not take a huge effect on our nation and the people who are dependent on these programs, because that's what we need. We need a strong middle class in order to come back out of this large debt and out of this large deficit.
Well, again, Medicare is the driver of the deficit. So, I mean, anything the government does, there's going to be problems associated with it. So it's a matter of trade-offs. The fact of the matter is, if we continue on the path that we're going on with Medicare, our deficits are going to be 280% of GDP. Our debt will be 280% of GDP by 2050, and never has it gone up that much except during wartime and when FDR decided we need to spend a lot of money during the Great Depression. So I mean, this isn't. It's not just like you can't ignore the problem. This should be the number one thing that we're trying to solve right now. So I mean, yeah, we can't just cut it. You don't just get rid of it. But there needs to be serious efforts to reform it. And your party's in power, and there hasn't been any talk about it from your party.
Well, there has been talk about it, and what we're planning to do for reforming is a long-term adjustment to the problem. We can't just go in immediately, because we need to give time to the beneficiaries of these entitlement programs to adjust for these changes. People are extremely dependent on them. You can't one day say to a 57-year-old woman who has been paying into Social Security her whole life and expecting to receive Medicare after her retirement, you can't just tell her that, listen, your benefits are now being cut, because that's what she has been planning on for her whole life. So solving through spending cuts alone is not going to fix the problem. We need to take gradual action towards these problems. And the numbers that you were talking about with the GDP, a recent example is the minor cuts that we made to defense in just the past few weeks, the GDP has dropped 0.1% already, and that was just when we cut barely anything out of defense. So if you can imagine what we would do in cuts through all social programs, it would be an extreme effect on our GDP in total, and it's something that we cannot do immediately.
That's what happens when you build up a lot of debt. At some point, you're going to have to feel some pain. So I mean, it's not, you can't avoid it. Now,
Well, I'd like to ask you, how did we build up that debt? Because the reason why we built up that debt was during the Bush administration, when we went to 2 wars that we did not budget for at all.
Well, okay. The wars was both parties agreed we should go to war. The tax cuts did not increase the deficit that much, if at all. Again, our debt right now is $16 trillion, which is nothing compared to what Medicare is going to cause it to be. It's going to be over $100 trillion. So yeah, my side can talk about unemployment benefits and tax cuts. Y'all can talk about tax increases. The problem with our deficits, those are principles. We believe that you shouldn't do too much welfare. Y'all believe that rich people should make more money. That's just principles. But the issue is Medicare. When you're talking about deficits, you have to solve Medicare, and that is the problem that y'all have not solved. And my party has put forth a plan. It wasn't a plan that everyone agrees on. It has a lot of vouchers, which people don't like. But what it did do is, if you put it into place, which it won't happen like it is, but if you did, it would solve the problem. So, if my party is a minority party, it's time for y'all to start solving the problem and not worry about, little things like what you were talking about with tax increases, which, tax increases fund the government for a couple of days. That's it.
Okay, well, the last thing that your party showed to the American people about becoming serious about the deficit issue was Paul Ryan's plan to destroy the Medicare program and turn it into a voucher program, which did not go over well with the American people, and they did their best to hide that during the presidential campaign. So when you guys want to become serious, you should want to show off these ideas that you have and not hide them during the campaign.
Part of the campaign. His speech at the convention was about Medicare. It was about, we have a plan. Now, some people, not everyone, there's not anyone who's gonna agree with everything in a big plan. But the way the country works is the two parties put forth a solution, and then everyone discusses them as a country, and then you have some kind of a middle ground whereby you have, and that's where you get the solution from.
And
Hopefully it works. But
I'm well aware of how
y'all-
this country works. What I'm saying is that your party has not come enough times to the table to say, okay, let's talk about reform, let's talk about compromise. What can we do, knowing that we only control half of a third of the government right now? That,
half of a third?
yes, that you guys, the only thing that you control right now in Washington is the House of Representatives.
Mhm.
You guys need to come together with us to come with a comprehensive plan to this deficit and to the debt. You can't just point the finger at us.
My party is the one with the comprehensive plan.
About Medicare to turn it into a voucher system.
About
That's the
about
reason for our
solving the
entire
Medicare problem.
deficit problem.
About solving the Medicare problem. My party is the one playing politics with everything and just ignoring Medicare and talking about, tax cuts and contraception and all these emotional issues that get votes but aren't solving the problem. You're the one.
30 seconds.
It's time for y'all to put forth a real solution for Medicare. The debate in the country can't happen because you're right. Half the country doesn't like the Republican Party. Half the country doesn't like your party, and the debate can't happen until your party puts forth something concrete which says this is what we're going to do about Medicare over time.
Okay. That was 6 minutes. There are 3 other teams that can't wait to get up here, so. We now have 1 minute closing now.
This question
Do we go, do we do Q&A or do we do the question? So what?
The Q&A after closing.
Okay, so who goes first?
I started though. You want Okay.
Same order.
Same order? Okay.
So the issue to our deficit and our debt is not Medicare. The issue right now is the fact that we have, for so long, have not budgeted properly the decisions that we've made in Washington. We as a party are not putting the blame entirely on the Bush administration whatsoever. It's not a blame game. What we're saying is that for too long in Washington, bills were being passed in the House that were not budgeted for, and that's the sole purpose of the House, is to make sure that they appropriate enough money and that there's a budget in place. What we're saying is that the way to fix this problem is to increase tax rates, and which we have done, and we have come up with a comprehensive plan to do so, and to also make minimal cuts to spending.
Yeah, I mean, it's just completely wrong. I don't want to hear any Democrat talk about a budget. That's completely ridiculous. My economics teacher worked in the Kennedy administration. He was in the Budget Bureau. He's still going strong. He's the most energetic person on this campus. But he was absolutely ripping apart Democrats for not having a budget, because back in the day, if you didn't have a budget, it was the most embarrassing thing. But so I don't want to hear any Democrats talk about budgets. But so when you talk about we need more tax cuts and moderate spending cuts, it's just completely wrong. People talk about how my party supports austerity, British-style austerity, which is wrong. They raise taxes a lot. We don't want to raise taxes right now in the middle of a slow economy. What we want to do is make it easier on the American people. And whose fault is it that we have the debt? You said it. It's Washington, whether it's Bush, Obama, or whoever. So Washington should solve its problem, its spending problem, and then fill in the gaps with tax increases once they have shown the American people that we're on a path to sustainable spending. But you don't start gutting everyone when everyone's having a rough time and the economy is bad, when you need to do your thing first.
Thank you. All right, we will spend approximately 3 or so minutes for questions. So now I've got to figure out who wants to ask questions. We'll take one from one side and then the other. Yes, sir.
I'd like to talk about Medicare fraud.
No, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. We don't want you to talk about it. Just state your question.
Yes, I do. So Medicare fraud, in 2011, they found that 50 billion of the 500 billion spent on Medicare was indeed defrauded towards the government. So I want to know, in your party's opinions, what's the best option, since it seems that accountability review boards haven't really worked out in the past. What's the best option to get rid of this fraud and maybe save a few bucks?
Well, I don't specifically know about that statistic. I don't know exactly how you get rid of the fraud. I mean, but when you're going to have something as big as Medicare, every time Washington has something huge amounts of money like entitlements and defense, there's going to be waste and there's going to be fraud. I mean, that's part of the consequence of doing that. In terms of Medicare reform, you're going to have to attack fee-for-service. That's 75% of the people in Medicare are fee-for-service, which means basically you can get whatever you want for your health care, and someone else, and the taxpayer is going to pay for it. So yeah, fraud, all that stuff. Yeah, we should get rid of it. I mean, I'm sure she would agree, but it's not easy to do because once you solve one thing, something else is going to come up.
I completely agree with that, and I think that in regards to Medicare, I think that the negatives of, yes, Medicare fraud, which is a real problem, that it's not as, the benefits of Medicare outweigh the negatives, that there are so many people that benefit from the system in an honest way, that yes, there's Medicare fraud, and we will take steps towards looking at that and adjusting to it, but that right now, currently, it's more important that people who actually need Medicare and are, have earned it, that they are entitled to it, and that's something that we'll look at in the future.
We should look at it now.
Okay, next question.
Talk about a financial plan, I think that's a great thing, that we need them. But how are we supposed to expect a comprehensive plan for the administration for the budget failed to garner a single vote from either party in Congress?
Definitely coming together. Yes, that's true, but coming together from both sides of the aisle is crucial. That the Republicans attempt to just delay this, which seems like a great thing. Like, yes, let's give us time to think about this, to come up with a compromise during these months before March 1st. It sounds great, and especially with the no budget, no pay, but I believe that that's just a way to re-strategize, to come out on an attack front, to say, okay, now we've had this time, we've compromised this much, that now we want this much, these many cuts in spending, and I think that right now, what we need to be focusing on is giving the American people a budget that they can see, that they can view and see, okay, down the line, this is what's gonna happen, and I don't think that's gonna be achieved through coming together in March and trying to get as much as we can from this from both sides of the aisle. It needs to be, what can we do for the American people that's best for them, rather than parties, for both sides.
Well, obviously, but the thing is, to me, it's pretty clear, we're not going to get big spending cuts with this political structure that we have right now in Washington. So the Democratic Party is, if you watch it, I'm weird, so I watch C-SPAN. I watch the House and the Senate. The Democrats don't care about spending right now. It's not something that they care about. And I think the actions of the president so far show that he doesn't care either. The second term just started. He's been talking about immigration reform. He's been talking about a bunch of other stuff, guns a lot. But again, during the fiscal cliff time, when we were on holiday, all they talked about was fiscal stuff. But now that we push forth the deadline, they're not going to talk about it until, there's 2 weeks left. It's like, you wait for an exam until the last day. So, I mean, I don't think when Democrats have this much control, we're going to get anything real. So I think it's important for the Republicans to stand their ground. So, I mean, you don't just compromise for stupid things. The best example was the infrastructure stuff. They were taking advantage of the bad economy. We want more infrastructure jobs. Bridges are collapsing. Let's just spend $500 billion on infrastructure. Well, that's fine if you want to do infrastructure, but if you're going to present it as $500 billion, I mean, Barack Obama didn't wake up one day and think, oh, maybe the Republicans will agree to $500 billion all of a sudden on infrastructure. So he's playing politics. He says we're going to do this, and then get the Republicans to say no, we don't want to do that, make them look bad, and he's still doing it, which is weird because he already won the election. So I just think that you have to wait and hope that the Republicans win in 2014 or something.
All right, I'd like to thank our presenters. There are seats in the front row and scattered throughout, in the back. Now's the time to make the move. Yes, All right, our next topic is gun control. This is a gun-free zone. All right, we are ready to begin. Republican side will begin this segment. We have 90
Okay. My name is Emma Tony from Nashville. In the past couple of months, the Second Amendment of the Constitution has been at the forefront of political debate. A slew of tragic mass shootings, perhaps most gravely the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School, have brought into question its limits, its intended meaning, and even its validity. The left is calling ever more for bans on weaponry ranging from magazine capacity limits, required psychological testing, so-called assault weapons bans, and on and on. I am here tonight to defend the individual right to keep and bear arms. Not only with evidence that supports it practically, but to defend it in spirit as one of our basic civil rights. We can all agree that something needs to be done to protect the citizens of this country and protect innocent children. However, further restrictions and limitations placed on the Second Amendment is not the answer. It's easy to say guns kill people. Guns are evil. More guns equals more violence. It's harder to face the reality that people kill people. That guns are not evil, but that we are. And that, in the words of Wayne LaPierre, the Executive Vice President of the NRA, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. It's hard to face the reality that we live in a very complex, very flawed world, and this makes gun control a very simple, naive solution to a very complicated problem. So tonight I am defending reality over hysteria, thoughtful reform over knee-jerk reaction, and most of all I am defending freedom over tyranny, liberty over control, and the precious idea that you are an adult and that you are responsible for your actions.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Bloody. I'm from New York, and New York is the best. I just wanted to say very quickly, thank you, Father Bentley, for hosting us. And just to get right to it, as a quick disclaimer, I just wanted to point out that gun rights are an extraordinarily important part of American society. I mean, we are the United States because we have certain rights like like the ability to bear arms. But at the same time, we need to understand the importance of moderation. Not just moderation in terms of gun control, but also moderation in terms of how we view what gun control is. We shouldn't think of it in absolutist terms that gun control equals no more guns ever. I don't think any of my Democratic colleagues, maybe a few, believe that. I certainly don't. And I'm not here to argue that. What I'm here to argue is a couple of very simple gun control proposals that I think the majority of Americans can agree with that would overall benefit our society as a whole. One of them being universal background checks, stopping the gun show loophole or the private sale of weapons that allows you to completely skirt around the background check that's needed. Shore up the ATF so that they have the proper needs to enforce a lot of the legislation or a lot of the regulation that's out there already. Another piece that hasn't really been around, but what they do in other countries is required training once you get to a certain caliber of power weapon. You go to, it's almost like how we're required to take a road test and register our car. It's the same way as when you buy a gun. You should be able, or you should be required to go through a certain amount of training once you purchase a certain caliber power gun. And finally, of course, the all-famous assault weapons ban. Hopefully, when we continue in our back and forth, I'll be able to point out more statistics about why it should be reinstated, and also why we should also have a ban on high-capacity magazines.
Thank you. Now we move into the 6-minute back and forth. So, Emma.
Okay, well, you mentioned the assault weapons ban, but I would like to point out that assault weapons has not really been defined by anything. It varies, differing by state, and honestly, there is very little difference between a handgun and an assault rifle. The difference is that assault rifles look scarier. They look like military rifles, but it's sort of an arbitrary thing to ban assault weapons, and there's nothing that limits that from further progressing further and further into banning handguns altogether. And yes.
I was just going to point out, actually, when you look at the previous assault weapons ban back from 1994, there were 19 distinct, or I believe roughly 19, over a dozen, distinct weapons that were completely banned as assault weapons. Then there were a number of other guns that would be classified as an assault weapon if it had 2 or more what's called cosmetic features. After the 1994 legislation passed, then what you had is gun manufacturers creating guns without the cosmetic features. That's why with this current round of legislation trying to push forward the assault weapons ban, you would also ban those guns that would have had the cosmetic features.
So there actually is a fairly defined notion of what an assault weapon is. I don't think that's as vague as you're putting it forward as.
Okay, well, I would counter that, once again, this is sort of an arbitrary ban. These cosmetic features aren't affecting statistics in any sort of way. Assault weapons bans have not really affected gun crime statistics, and if you want to get into that, gun crimes committed by handguns are vastly outnumber those committed with assault rifles.
That's absolutely correct. Which is why the gun control that would be proposed is not solely an assault weapons ban. That'd be way too simplistic. We tried that back in 1994 to 2004, and it worked, but just not as statistically significant as we wanted to see. But actually, when you think about it, granted, yes, you do have handguns. Handguns are the most used gun when it comes to gun violence. But when you actually look at the statistics for the assault weapon usage from 1994 through the years that the ban took place, you actually saw a 75% decrease in assault weapon use in gun violence. Granted, that's only going from about 4.6% to 1% of gun violence being caused by assault weapons, but that's 75% of assault weapons being decreased, and I mean, you think about the amount of bullets that those things can spray out, that can mean dozens, possibly hundreds of lives, when you're talking a country that murders 12,000 or so a year through guns.
I'm curious as to why you think it's relevant that 75% of assault weapon crime ended, because obviously if there's a ban on it, you're going to see a decrease in that type of crime ending. But what I wanted to say was, it really, I think it has less to do with how much we ban our weapons and restrict our weapons than other factors such as concealed carry permits. And statistically, areas who allow their citizens to have concealed weapons, or open carry at least, have fewer gun crimes. And areas which are targeted by mass shooters or criminals in general are areas where the citizens are disarmed. Gun-free zones like schools and movie theaters and malls.
Well, just to point to something that you made before, it's surprising. When you look at the 4 states with the highest amount of guns per capita in them, typically they tend to be from the South. I actually think Texas is one of them. They're 7 times more likely to have gun violence and homicides than they are as the 4 states with the least amount of guns. I believe it's Hawaii, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, one of those 4. So really, I don't see a correlation between how less guns equals more violence. I think that's just counterintuitive, and it's unfortunately simplistic.
Well, I would question those statistics that you got that say that more.
The
If gun control were effective, what about Chicago? This is an area of the country that has some of the strictest gun control laws of anywhere. And 2012, here, I have some numbers here, if I can find them. 2012 saw a staggering number of gun violence deaths in Chicago, more than I think than the U.S. soldiers killed in Afghanistan. And just in 2013, we have seen an increase again in gun violence that would project them to over 700 deaths this year, which is 2 per day.
You're right. I totally agree with that. The gun violence in our urban cities is way too high, and we need to do something about that, which I believe is an even more reason to push more federal legislation, hold these states accountable for increasing their gun control, because granted, the cities have very tight gun control. New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, but the guns, we all know, they're coming in from other states. That's more of a reason to create this federal legislation to prevent guns from being in the wrong hands in the first place. Not just in Chicago, not just in New York, not just in LA, but throughout the entire United States. It's a fairly simple thing. When it comes to a thing like background checks, 92% of Americans agree with me that the universal background check should be done. And it's the simple things like that that can really just stem gun violence in the United States.
I would agree that background checks may be a good idea and that can be explored, but if you are a criminal, if you are looking to commit criminal activity with a gun, I don't think any sort of law is going to stop you from getting a gun. Guns are a reality in America, and, you know, if you are a criminal, you obviously don't care about assault weapons bans. You don't care about laws that restrict guns. You're going to find a gun anyway. And further restricting the ability to get guns will only disarm those citizens who are willing to abide by those laws. And further, I think that it's often neglected that the Second Amendment is not only for the defense of citizens, but it's also for the ability to form a militia in case the United States becomes tyrannical, which sounds outlandish today, but over the course of history, many democracies have turned from democracy to tyranny, and if it doesn't happen in our lifetime, it could certainly happen in the future. Further and further disarming our citizens would put them at risk of being.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now going to the 6 minutes. Oh, that's right, sorry. It's closing statements, then Q&A.
Closing statement.
So it follows logically that criminals do not want to target areas where gun ownership is high. No mass criminal is going to go to an area where you're allowed to carry guns, and statistic evidence supports this. And I'd like to say more broadly that freedom does come with a risk. If we want the freedom to own guns, that comes with a risk. And the truth is that we will always live in a world with crime and murder, and there are several reforms and several ways to reduce this. Mental health, harsher punishments for illegal carry, more security measures in gun-free zones. There are many areas that can stand to be reformed that do not involve further infringement upon our civil liberties for owning guns. There is an old quote they used to say in the Old West that God made man, but Sam Colt made them equal. And I personally believe this. I'm a small girl. If someone wanted to attack me, they would probably be able to do it. If I had a gun, that would put me on an equal plane with them. I think
Okay. Thank you. On that note, we're closing.
Now, I would like to emphasize the 3 points that I made before, where we need to increase, we need to install universal background checks, we need to create gun training. We also need to have a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Also, a realistic approach really does need to be taken. Gun control does not mean taking the guns out of the hands of American citizens who are law-abiding. It just means keeping them from going into the hands of those who don't. Granted, it may not work all the time. There are obviously going to be cracks in the system, but that doesn't mean that we should completely abandon the idea that people run stop signs. Do we eliminate those? No. It's counterintuitive, the idea that more guns will mean less violence. I mean, you can run through pages and pages of statistics that show that. It's unbelievable. I think looking back, our parents' generation will be seen almost as the generation that, these people thought this. It's almost how we look back in the 60s and they say, oh, smoking doesn't cause cancer. No, it's illogical. And I want to leave you with a quote from a former NRA president, Carl Frederick. I have never believed in the general practice of carrying weapons. I think it should be sharply restricted and only under licenses. This is back when the NRA actually just endorsed gun control and gun safety rather than guns.
Thank you. All right, now we go to question and answer. Let's see. We're going to go to this side first.
All right, so I'd like to ask you a question pertaining to the idea of Americans having the right to form militia. What would you say is the chances of Americans with assault weapons beating the largest military buildup in known history, including nuclear bombs?
Okay, I would say that it's very unlikely that a tyrannical U.S. government would nuclear bomb us, and I would also say that it's unlikely that they would attack a citizenry that was armed, because they know that citizens are going to fight back. However, obviously, if our government decided to turn tyrannical, that would be an entirely different ballgame. I mean, I really haven't thought it out that far, because
But what's the application of the assault weapons?
the application is that we have the right to defend ourselves
But
against.
defend yourself against the government's not going to attack you.
No, the government could attack us, if not in our generation, in generations in the future. And that's happened throughout history, so that has basis in history. I mean, guns would definitely help our side with that, especially assault rifles that would be more accurate and be able to carry. Yeah, that's a gun.
When it comes to the right of forming militias, I'm not big on constitutional, purism where obviously it needs to be the rule of law. I mean, you got the 3/5 clause, which was crazy. But I think that's a harmless thing, to have the right to form a militia. Actually, I think my old high school teacher had technically a well-regulated militia, but I think it was just him with a gun in his house, but that was it. But I don't see that there's any problem with that. I don't believe in the United States becoming tyrannical, but I don't see any problem with that militia.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you clarify what you meant by universal background check?
Yes, I would love to. So what it is right now, the system that we have, the states, what is supposed to happen is the states are supposed to submit all their mental health records and all their drug testing records to the FBI, so the FBI can almost create a database. Unfortunately, only about half the states actually do that. 30 of the 50 states only submit drug testing records. And then within the past decade, you've only actually seen an increase from about 12 states in terms of mental health records. That entire system needs to be completely revamped. And also, like I said before, the gun show loophole. It basically says if I want to sell a gun to you and you were mentally unfit to actually purchase one on your own, we wouldn't need to go through a background check for me to make that transaction. With universal background checks, you would need to go through that system in order for me to sell that weapon to you.
Okay, and how do you feel
Wait,
about...
you had your question, so
Oh, I'm sorry.
no follow-ups.
I would say that background checks probably would be a reasonable institution, but I would like to point out that someone who is actually applying to legally obtain a gun is probably not a criminal. People who own guns are typically law-abiding citizens, so once again, the relevance of the background check, who knows. I would also object to having mental health records available to people for background checks because that would be an infringement on privacy. But yeah, I do think that background checks, these criminal background checks and drug testing would be a reasonable.
One of the main points of the Republican argument against gun control is that people kill people. So you'd like to, spend more money, to say, on mental care and stuff like that, which are social programs, which Republicans are historically not into spending money on. So is that just something you guys are saying, or is that actually going to happen if that's what you're proposing?
Okay, actually, I don't think that more money needs to be thrown at the problem. I think what people are referring to with the mental health reform, and this is a very complicated issue, so there's not going to be one solution to the problem, but it's very hard in states, in some states, to have someone institutionalized. And people recoil at that, people don't like it, but in the case of these mass shooters, Adam Lanza, Sweden, the Virginia Tech guy, I can't pronounce his name, Jared Lochner, the Tucson mall shooter, all of these people, the people around them knew what was coming. One of their teachers even said, like, I was afraid to turn around and write on the board because this student, I was afraid they would pull out a gun. Part of mental health reform is making it easier for these people to get the help they need and to be institutionalized.
I guess I would totally agree with that, just to make it quick so you might be able to get one more in. Yes, the mental health system obviously needs to be revamped. That should be a part of this new legislation. Another thing, actually, just a quick food for thought. The NRA actually stopped all funding towards gun safety research back in the 1990s, as in how it relates to gun violence back in the 1990s. And then now they're calling on the United States government to completely pay for school guards in every single elementary school with nearly 4 desks. I mean, I just find it completely unbelievable. Ludicrous.
Young man, no.
All right. I have a question for you. Are you familiar with Dunblane, Scotland, and the school massacre that happened there?
Yes, I am.
All right. So for everybody who doesn't know about it, back in 1996, something similar to Sandy Hook Elementary School happened in Dunblane. 18 were killed, 15 were injured, and the political response of the UK was immediately to put stricter controls on gun laws. And there hasn't been a school shooting in the UK since. Why do you think that this wouldn't work for the United States?
There may not have been a school shooting, but you have seen a rise in gun crime in the UK. And, I mean, I think school shootings have to do with very, very mentally disturbed individuals. You know, those criminals like that do not come around often. So, I mean, the fact that there hasn't been a school shooting doesn't necessarily reflect the stricter gun laws, but I do think the rise in gun violence is a reflection of those laws.
I guess I would agree. Already in the United States, there's so many guns in circulation, I believe that's around 88 per citizen. So, I'm per 100 citizens, my bad. So, you know, to completely ban weapons, you're still going to have these types of problems. But, I mean, there's not much that you can do. You just need to prevent the gun from falling into the wrong hands.
All right, thank you. Next topic, the war in Afghanistan. All right, folks. We're going to now talk about war. The Democrats will begin the conversation.
On October 7, 2001, the war in Afghanistan began. Since then, 2,200 Americans have been killed in action, 18,000 have been wounded. On a personal note, that includes my brother Chris, who served 2 tours. And we have spent $800 billion and are currently spending $7 billion a month. And many of you may not know this, it is actually the longest war in American history. Anyone sitting in this room, likely, it has been going on for the majority of your life, with the exception of Father Anderson. Currently, we have 66,000 troops, and while I don't always agree with President Obama on everything as a Democrat, his current plan I am in complete agreement with. What we need to start doing is I'm not advocating for a full, pull everyone out right now, but we need to start pulling troops out. And I think the current plan to pull out 40 by the end of 2014 and leave about 15,000 in is the way to go. This war has cost thousands of lives, hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's time for us to get out. I would like to think that Republicans would be okay with a plan that involves saving up to $7 billion a month and, saving Americans' lives in the way. I think, obviously I agree that we should have gone in. We had good reason to go in. There was a terrorist threat and we needed to take care of it. But it's 10 years later, the costs have been ridiculously high, and it is time to start figuring out an exit strategy.
Thanks.
Alright, first off, I truly want to offer my sincerest condolences. I'm really
He's fine.
sorry.
He was wounded. He was. So, I don't want to mislead anyone.
Still, it's tragic and I'm sorry. Last year, President Obama made a statement. The reason we went to war in the first place is now within reach, ensuring that Al-Qaeda can never again use Afghanistan to launch attacks against our country. What I question, though, is that goal really within reach? Are we really confident that Al-Qaeda won't use Afghanistan ever again to launch attacks? The Taliban, which is known to work with and provide a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, is still in control of much of Afghanistan. As of now, the Obama administration, from what I knew, is planning on withdrawing 60,000 troops and only leaving 6,000, whom will most likely not have diplomatic immunity, might I add. In my opinion, shared by much of the Republican Party, which I'm representing tonight, this is a grave mistake that will likely lead to the reversal of everything we have worked for this far. Taking our troops out so abruptly, that's the key point, abruptly, is going to leave the Afghan security forces weak and vulnerable against the Taliban, which still has a great influence on Afghan politics. As it is, Afghan President Hamid Karzai is having a hard time granting the U.S. troops immunity because the senior tribal leaders from the south who work with the Taliban do not believe the troops should be immune from Islamic laws. Not only that, the Taliban actually has support of many Afghan citizens. Claiming that our goal is now within reach is a fallacy. If we abruptly leave now, it is likely the Taliban will resume power and continue to terrorize the Afghan people, the U.S. troops, and even America itself.
Thanks. Now we go to a 6-minute discussion with our presenters.
Okay. The numbers I'm not exactly specific on. I know a number of plans have been thrown out. This isn't, I don't think actually they have set on a plan. I know the Obama administration is committed, in fact, to pulling out troops. And I do think that's the way to go. I don't think leaving every troop we have in there is the right way to go about it. We're not, it's been 11 years and we have decimated the terrorist forces there. But one of the things is, why are we expecting that they're simply going to just rely on Afghanistan as their stronghold? Clearly they have a stronghold across the Middle East. Occupying one country isn't going to make that much of a difference. Osama bin Laden was clearly hanging out in Pakistan for however long, and we had no idea. The cost-benefit analysis isn't in our favor anymore. We're not gaining that much power, and we're not winning the war on terror, in the way that we should be, when we could be pulling troops out, saving troops' lives, and then switching to a more modern form of warfare that includes drone strikes and more targeted attacks on terrorists.
Well, first off, I would like the plans, so there are 3 different plan options: to leave 12,000 in, to leave 10,000 in, and to leave 6,000 in. Currently, the Obama administration is in favor of leaving 6,000 troops in Afghanistan, when most of the senior generals are in favor of leaving 15,000, which isn't even an option. Also, yes, you're right.
NATO would make up the difference, actually. That is a thing. NATO would end up we would have about, the Obama administration wants to leave in 6, I think, and then NATO would make up 8, but if we left 10 in, NATO would add it to 20.
But in total, America has 66,000 troops, but with NATO and all the other forces, there are 104,000. So
why do we need that many troops in there to begin with?
we don't need that many troops in there to begin with, and I agree that we should withdraw, but I don't think we should take out 60,000 troops of our own within, a course of a year and a half. That's just going to leave the Afghan security forces really weak and really vulnerable, especially to the Taliban, who has a major stronghold. People don't recognize that. Most of Afghani citizens, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, and actually NATO last year prepared a document to give to all of the people attending this conference, and in this document it says many Afghans are already bracing themselves for an eventual return of the Taliban. They also state that Afghan civilians frequently prefer Taliban governance over the GIROA, which is the governing Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So people favor the Taliban, and if the Taliban comes back, we're going to be right where we were in 2001, and then what? Are we going to go in again and waste more money and waste more lives? Instead, we could just gradually withdraw ourselves.
It seems like the way you're arguing is that we need to leave the same amount we have, but that hasn't worked. It's been 10 years. So the way I see it, then, the only way to fix this is to just put more troops in, even more troops. And, how could we possibly change the ideology of an entire country so that they decide, oh, the Taliban are bad? This is an unrealistic goal. We're literally chasing our tails there, and American lives are being cost in the process. And we're wasting literally billions of dollars a month on this. We're not gaining anything out of this.
Obviously, we're not going to change Islamic fundamentalist society. We can't change their religion. That's nothing.
I'm not saying their religion, their political beliefs.
Yes, but
You're saying that they would support a Taliban government. What can we do about that?
What we can do is
Just kill a majority of the people there, and then hope that of the minority that's left is like, yeah, the Taliban were jerks. How long are we gonna have to be there before we make the security forces, sustain themselves?
Well, I'm not saying that we have to be there forever, but if we pull out at the rate that Obama wants us to pull out, the Taliban is likely to take over. I don't think that we should leave 66,000 troops in there. I do think we should start withdrawing, because we have been in there for 11 years and 2,000 people have died and 18,000 are wounded. But I think that we have to do it slowly and let the security forces, let them get used to being without us, so that they know what they can do to make sure that the Taliban doesn't take over. If we just pull out, they're left there by themselves. Not by themselves, I know there are going to be 6,000 people still there, but they're practically left there by themselves just to be like, oh God, now the Taliban's going to come attack me. You don't want that to happen.
I have a lot more faith in the American military strength than you do. I think
The
6,000.
6,000 people?
Oh, yes. But I really just don't think, bless you, sorry.
Wasting time.
I don't think that we need, pulling out that quickly, I don't think it would have as drastic effects as you think it would. And even if we did let's say we take 10 years to do it, I don't think the Afghan security forces would be any more prepared or any less prepared. We spent 10 years training them. I think they're as prepared as they're going to be, and it's just gonna have to be trial by fire. It's not our business anymore. And we can still help them out, and we're still gonna have I was just reading the other day, we're setting up a drone base in Egypt to monitor the entire Middle East. We can manage the terrorist threat that exists in Afghanistan and the entire Middle East without having boots on the ground. I would point you to our toppling of Gaddafi. We didn't have to put a single American boot on the ground, and we toppled the dictatorship.
Okay, I just stick to my point that if we withdraw that abruptly, it's not going to be pretty.
Well, speaking of pretty, I'm looking at the audience. I had to have a humorous section after this heavy discussion. Questions? Oh, why do I do this every time? Closing. Louis.
Yeah, first. Just in closing, this war has taken, it's been 11 years, it's been a lot of money, it's cost a lot of lives. And I don't disagree that there is still a terrorist threat and there is still an issue to be dealt with in Afghanistan, but I don't think we need to be dealing with it as head-on as we have been. I think we've done what we went there to do, and we have decimated a huge portion of the terrorist threat that existed, and I think it's time for us to just pull out, bring those troops home, start doing some nation building here, and we'll deal with the remaining terrorist threat from a distance where we don't have to have boots on the ground getting killed every day.
I would like to say that I agree. I do think that we've been in there for 11 years. We've spent so much money and tragically lost too many people. But I don't think that pulling out 60,000 troops within a year and a half is the way to go about doing this. In the end, we have a much higher. If it doesn't happen, then thank God that the Taliban doesn't take over again. But if we pull out that abruptly, there's a much higher risk that they will come back into power. And then what are we going to do? Go back in, spend more money, lose more lives? It's more worth it if we just take our time and gradually come out so that Afghan security forces have time to figure out real-life application, not just what we taught them, but how to apply that when we're no longer there.
All right, now for the fun part. Questions? Mr. Bill.
Yeah,
Like your shirt.
thank you. This is for both candidates, but maybe more specifically, the Democratic candidate. With a troop withdrawal, or of, more specifically, I'm thinking of the larger magnitude, which